The small town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was a quiet, picturesque community where life moved at a leisurely pace. The townsfolk were friendly, the streets were safe, and the most exciting event of the year was the annual Harvest Festival. But all of that changed one fateful morning when the Thompson family vanished without a trace. The Thompsons had been a staple of Willow Creek for as long as anyone could remember. John and Mary Thompson were a loving couple in their early 40s, with 2 children, Emily, aged 10, and Jack, aged 8. They were the kind of family that everyone admired, hardworking, kind, and always willing to lend a helping hand. Their home, a charming 2-story house with a white picket fence, was located at the end of Maple Street, just a stone's throw away from the edge of the forest. It was a crisp autumn morning when the news of their disappearance spread like wildfire through the town. The first to notice something was amiss was Mrs. Henderson, the Thompsons' next-door neighbor. She had grown accustomed to seeing Mary Thompson tending to her garden every morning, but on this particular day, the garden was untouched, and the house was eerily silent. Concerned, Mrs. Henderson knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. She peered through the windows, but the curtains were drawn, and she couldn't see inside. Growing more anxious by the minute, she called the local police. Officer Dan Harris was the first to arrive on the scene. He was a seasoned officer with over 20 years of experience, but even he was taken aback by the strange circumstances surrounding the Thompson family's disappearance. The front door was locked, and there were no signs of forced entry. The family's car was still parked in the driveway, and all of their personal belongings, including their wallets, phones, and even Jack's favorite teddy bear, were still inside the house. As Officer Harris began his investigation, he quickly realized that this was no ordinary missing persons case. The Thompsons had seemingly vanished into thin air, leaving behind no clues as to their whereabouts. The entire town was in a state of shock, and rumors began to circulate. Some speculated that the family had been abducted, while others believed they had fled in the middle of the night to escape some unknown danger. But as the days turned into weeks, the mystery only deepened. The police conducted an extensive search of the surrounding area, but there was no sign of the Thompsons. The forest was combed, the nearby river was dredged, and even the abandoned mines on the outskirts of town were explored, but all efforts proved futile. The townsfolk were on edge, and the once peaceful community was now gripped by fear and paranoia. People began to lock their doors at night, and parents kept a close eye on their children. The disappearance of the Thompson family had shattered the illusion of safety that had once defined Willow Creek. As the investigation continued, Officer Harris uncovered a series of strange and unsettling details about the Thompsons' lives. It turned out that John Thompson had been experiencing financial difficulties in the months leading up to their disappearance. He had taken out a second mortgage on the house and had been struggling to make ends meet. Mary Thompson, on the other hand, had been acting strangely in the weeks before they vanished. She had become increasingly withdrawn and had stopped attending her usual social gatherings. But perhaps the most baffling clue was the discovery of a series of cryptic notes found scattered throughout the house. The notes were written in a hurried, almost frantic handwriting, and they contained a series of seemingly random words and phrases. Some of the notes read, "They're watching us. We can't trust anyone, and the shadows are closing in." Officer Harris was at a loss. The notes didn't make any sense, and they only added to the mystery. He consulted with a handwriting expert, who confirmed that the notes were indeed written by Mary Thompson, but beyond that, there was no explanation for their content. As the weeks turned into months, the case grew cold, and the Thompsons' disappearance became a haunting enigma that lingered over Willow Creek. The once vibrant community was now a shadow of its former self, and the memory of the Thompson family was a constant reminder of the fragility of life. But just when it seemed like the mystery would never be solved, a breakthrough occurred. A hiker exploring the dense forest on the outskirts of town stumbled upon a hidden cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was old and dilapidated, but what caught the hiker's attention was the faint sound of voices coming from inside. The hiker immediately contacted the police, and Officer Harris led a team to investigate. As they approached the cabin, they could hear the voices more clearly. They were faint and muffled, but there was no mistaking the sound of human voices. With caution, Officer Harris and his team entered the cabin. What they found inside was both shocking and heartbreaking. The Thompson family was there, alive but in a state of utter despair. They were huddled together in a corner of the cabin, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes filled with fear. John Thompson was the first to speak. His voice was weak and trembling as he explained what had happened. He revealed that the family had been living in fear for months, convinced that they were being watched and followed. They had received anonymous threats and had found strange symbols etched into their front door. Fearing for their lives, they had decided to flee in the middle of the night, leaving behind everything they knew. But their escape had not gone as planned. They had intended to drive to a nearby town and start a new life. But as they were leaving, they had been ambushed by a group of masked men. The men had forced them into the back of a van and had driven them deep into the forest, where they had been held captive in the cabin ever since. The Thompsons had no idea who their captors were or why they had been targeted. They had been given just enough food and water to survive, but they had been subjected to constant psychological torment. Their captors had played mind games with them, leaving them in a state of perpetual fear and uncertainty. Officer Harris listened in stunned silence as John Thompson recounted their harrowing ordeal. It was clear that the family had been through a living nightmare, and the trauma they had endured would take years to heal. As the Thompsons were taken to safety, Officer Harris and his team began to piece together the events that had led to their disappearance. It turned out that the Thompsons had been the victims of a sinister plot orchestrated by a local cult that had been operating in secret for years. The cult had targeted the Thompsons because they had inadvertently stumbled upon one of their rituals while hiking in the forest. The cult had been using the abandoned mines on the outskirts of town as a base of operations, and they had been conducting dark and twisted rituals in the depths of the forest. The Thompsons had witnessed one of these rituals, and the cult had deemed them a threat that needed to be eliminated. But the cult's plan had backfired. The Thompsons' disappearance had drawn too much attention, and the police had been closing in on them. In a desperate attempt to cover their tracks, the cult had decided to release the Thompsons, hoping that their story would be dismissed as the ramblings of a traumatized family. But Officer Harris was not so easily fooled. He launched a full-scale investigation into the cult, and within weeks, he had gathered enough evidence to bring them to justice. The cult's leader, a charismatic but deranged man named Ezekiel Blackwood, was arrested along with several of his followers. The trial that followed was a media sensation, and the town of Willow Creek watched in horror as the dark secrets of the cult were revealed. Ezekiel Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison, and his followers were given lengthy prison terms. As for the Thompson family, they slowly began to rebuild their lives. They moved to a new town, far away from the memories of their ordeal, and they sought therapy to help them cope with the trauma they had endured. It was a long and difficult road, but they were determined to move forward and reclaim their lives. The disappearance of the Thompson family had left an indelible mark on the town of Willow Creek. It was a stark reminder that even in the most idyllic of places, darkness could lurk just beneath the surface. But it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of hope. As the years passed, the memory of the Thompsons' disappearance began to fade, but it was never forgotten. The town of Willow Creek eventually returned to its peaceful ways, But the lessons learned from that fateful autumn morning would stay with its residents forever. And so, the story of the vanishing neighbor became a cautionary tale, a reminder to always be vigilant and to cherish the ones we love. For in the blink of an eye, everything can change, and the world as we know it can vanish into thin air.